A king once killed his own son, cut him into pieces, cooked him, and served him to the gods at a dinner he was hosting, just to find out whether they were really paying attention. Picture the hall where it happens. Wood smoke and roasting meat, the torches burned low, and outside, the mountain dark with its gold asleep in the veins of the rock. Inside, the host is smiling to himself, lifting the lid from a dish he prepared with his own hands. And what is under that lid is his child. This is one of the oldest horror stories the Greeks ever told, and they told it without flinching. I am not going to flinch around it either, because there is no gentle way to the center of this one. His name was Tantalus, and he was not some wild outsider who knew no better. He was a man so favored by the gods that they had invited him to their own table as an equal, trusted, welcomed, treated as one of the family. He took that trust and used it to run an experiment. He wanted to know whether the immortals were genuinely all-knowing, and so he tested them with the one dish nobody would ever dare to serve. Not a monster doing monstrous things. A privileged man, fully aware of what he was doing, choosing the single most unforgivable thing a host could do, and doing it as a kind of dare. Here is the strange part, the part that makes this more than just a horror story. You have been carrying this man's name around your whole life without knowing it. When you say that something is tantalizing, a smell drifting from a kitchen, a name on the tip of your tongue, anything held just out of your reach, you are speaking the name Tantalus. The word comes directly from what the gods did to him after that dinner. We will get there. For now, just sit with the oddness of it. A word you have used 1,000 times, soft and almost pleasant, is the fossil of one of the cruelest punishments the Greeks ever imagined. So settle in. You are not in that hall. You are somewhere warm and safe, and the fire over there is the only thing that needs your attention. And it is doing fine on its own. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have crept up to. We are going to take this slowly. There is a great deal here, and none of it requires anything from you except that you stay a little while. Before we go further into the dark, where are you tonight? If you feel like it, leave a note below. The city, the hour, whether the rain is coming down or the heat won't break. It has quietly become my favorite thing about doing this, opening the comments and finding people scattered across every time zone, all of them lying in the dark at the same odd hour, all of them listening to the same old story. I read them. You are not the only one awake. Now, let us go back to the table. The gods came to Tantalus often. This is the detail every ancient writer agreed on, even when they agreed on nothing else. He was not a stranger to them. He sat at their banquets on Olympus, shared their nectar and their ambrosia, listened to conversations no other mortal was permitted to hear. He was, as far as the old stories go, the only mortal ever to hold a standing invitation to dine with the gods, which is precisely the kind of honor that tends, slowly and quietly, to go to a person's head. He had been let all the way in, and one day, returning the hospitality, he invited them down to his own hall to eat. What moved him to do what he did next, the sources will not quite say. Some hint at arrogance, the swelling of a man who has been treated as a god long enough to wonder whether the gods are really so different from him. Some say he wanted to prove they were frauds, that their famous omniscience was a story they told about themselves. Whatever the reason, he carried his young son into the kitchen, and he came back out with a meal. The gods knew. Of course they knew. They sat at that table and they understood, immediately and completely, what was steaming in front of them, and not one of them lifted a hand to it. Not one, except one. Demeter, the goddess of the grain and the harvest, was not herself that season. Her daughter Persephone had been taken down into the underworld, and Demeter was moving through the world half-blind with grief, the kind of grief that empties a person out so thoroughly that the body keeps performing its small habits while the mind is somewhere else entirely. And so, distracted, hollowed, not seeing what was in front of her. She reached out and ate a piece of the shoulder. In Ovid's Roman telling, she is called Ceres, but it is the same goddess and the same terrible, absent-minded bite, a mother mourning one child, swallowing a piece of someone else's. The others recoiled. And then they did the thing that turns this from a tragedy into something stranger. They put the boy back together. They gathered the pieces from the pot and reassembled him. And the sources say Pelops came out of that cauldron alive, restored, made whole, a child given a second birth out of boiling water. The Greeks did not seem to find this part absurd. Rebirth out of a cooking pot sat comfortably inside how they understood the boundary between death and life, which was always more porous than ours. But there was a problem. One piece was missing. The piece Demeter had eaten could not be returned, and so where his shoulder had been there was now a gap. And here the gods improvised. They cut a replacement out of ivory and fitted it into him, smooth and pale and perfect, and sealed the boy up around it. Hold on to that ivory shoulder. I am asking you to remember it specifically because it is going to come back near the end of tonight, in a way you will not see coming. And when it does, it is going to quietly rearrange everything you thought this story was about. For now, it is just a beautiful, eerie detail, a living boy walking around with a piece of carved ivory set into his body where his father's knife once went. The boy's name was Pelops. Remember him. He is the son. He survives this. He grows up. And what he does with his survival is its own dark thing, which we will also reach. But first, who was the man who did this? Because a stranger could do something cruel, and we would shrug. The horror of this depends entirely on who Tantalus was. Tantalus was a king, and his kingdom was real enough that you can go and stand in it. He ruled near Mount Sipylus, in Lydia, in what is now western Turkey, not far from the modern city of Izmir. This was not a poor or marginal place. Lydia was a land of gold. Its rivers, the Hermus and the Pactolus, ran with it, and centuries later the same region would produce some of the first true coined money in human history. Excavations near the later Lydian capital of Sardis have turned up Bronze Age occupation, monumental building, trade routes reaching deep into the Aegean world. The legend of a fabulously wealthy king in those hills has a foundation you can dig down to. The wealth was there, the gold was there. Whoever the real memory behind Tantalus was, he sat on top of something genuinely rich. And in the myth, that wealth came with intimacy. Tantalus was, depending on the source, a son of Zeus himself by a nymph, which made him, in the most literal sense, family. He was the mortal the gods chose to treat as one of their own. Imagine that for a moment. Not worship from a distance, not prayers sent up and hopefully received, but a seat at the table. The actual table. He heard their plans. He knew their secrets. He ate food that was supposed to make a mortal immortal. The Greeks had several theories about how a man with all of that managed to ruin it, and they did not entirely agree, which is itself worth noticing. The myth of Tantalus is not one fixed thing. It is a cluster of crimes, and different writers reached for different ones, and sometimes for several at once. In one version, his crime was theft. He took the nectar and ambrosia from the god's own table and carried it back down to share with his mortal friends, handing out the food of immortality to people who had no right to it, a kind of divine smuggling. In another, his crime was his mouth. He could not keep the gods' secrets, and he repeated to mortals the things he had heard in confidence on Olympus, betraying every conversation he had been trusted with. There is even a strange subplot involving a golden dog, a magnificent mechanical mastiff forged by Hephaestus to guard the infant Zeus, which a thief stole and passed to Tantalus, and which Tantalus then refused to give back, lying about it to the gods' faces. And then, of course, there is the feast, the serving of his son. For most of the ancient world, this was the crime. the one that swallowed all the others. What unites them all, when you stand back, is not cruelty exactly. It is a particular kind of betrayal. Every single one of Tantalus's crimes is a violation of trust by someone who had been given more trust than any mortal in history. The theft, the loose tongue, the lie about the dog, the unspeakable dinner, they are all the same crime wearing different clothes. A man was let inside, and he used being inside to break the thing that being inside was built on. And that is the part the Greeks were really thinking about. To understand why the feast in particular was beyond forgiveness, why it was worse than theft, worse than gossip, worse than anything, we have to talk about a meal. Not that meal, the idea of a meal, and what it meant to share one. There is a concept that runs underneath nearly all of Greek myth, so deep that the Greeks rarely bothered to explain it because everyone already breathed it. It was called xenia. The usual translation is guest friendship, which sounds quaint, like something to do with table manners. It was not quaint. It was one of the load-bearing walls of the entire moral world. Xenia was the sacred, binding, two-way obligation between a host and a guest. A stranger arrives at your door, tired and far from home. You take him in. You do not ask his name or his business first. You feed him, you give him water and a place by the fire, and only afterward, once he is warm and fed, do you ask who he is. In return, he owes you respect, gratitude, and the same hospitality should you ever come to his door. This was not optional politeness. It was watched over by Zeus himself in his role as Zeus Xenios, the protector of guests and strangers. To violate it was not rudeness, it was sacrilege. Once you understand that, the whole architecture of Greek myth reorganizes itself in front of you. Think about it. The Trojan War begins as a violation of Xenia. Paris is a guest in the house of Menelaus, and he repays that hospitality by stealing his host's wife. The Cyclops in the Odyssey is a monster precisely because he inverts Xenia. Instead of feeding his guests, he eats them, and offers Odysseus the grotesque gift of being devoured last. The shared meal was the most concentrated expression of this bond. To sit and eat at someone's table was to be, for that moment, sacred to one another. Nothing that happened over food could be neutral. Now put Tantalus back at his table and feel how the temperature drops. He did not merely murder his son, terrible as that is. He took the single most sacred act available to a host, the offering of food to a guest, and he weaponized it. He took the bond that held the whole civilized world together, and he poisoned it at its source. And his guests were not ordinary travelers. They were the gods who invented the bond, the very powers who punished its violation. He served a corrupted meal to the divine enforcers of the meal. There was no deeper place to strike. He found the floor of the moral universe, and he broke through it. This is why across every version, the punishment is so total and so strange. The Greeks were not just disgusted by the cannibalism, though they were that. They were watching a man break the one rule that made it possible for humans to trust one another at all. A world without Xenia is a world where you cannot accept a cup of water from anyone, because the cup might be poison and the table might be a trap. Tantalus tried to make that the truth, and so the gods devised something for him. Not death. Death would have been a mercy and a release. Something that would last and that would speak. There is a line in this story between the crime and the punishment so precise that it has survived, unbroken, into the language you are listening in right now. But the punishment itself is its own quiet masterpiece of cruelty, and to feel its full weight, we have to go down into the dark place where he serves it. The oldest description we have of Tantalus in the underworld comes from Homer, in the 11th book of the Odyssey, when Odysseus travels down to the land of the dead and sees the famous sinners suffering their endless sentences. He sees Sisyphus and his stone. He sees Tantalus too. And what Homer shows us is so simple it is almost unbearable. Tantalus stands in a pool of water that comes up to his chin. He is desperately thirsty, a thirst that never ends, never dulls, never lets him think about anything else. The water is right there, lapping at his throat. And every time he bends his head to drink, the water drains away beneath him, sinking into the dark earth, leaving the ground at his feet dry and cracked until he straightens up in despair, at which point it rises again to his chin. Over his head hang the boughs of fruit trees, heavy and ripe, pears, pomegranates, sweet figs, apples, olives, everything a starving man could want, close enough to smell. And every time he reaches up, the wind lifts the branches just out of the reach of his fingers. Water he cannot drink, fruit he cannot eat, forever. Surrounded by abundance, perishing of want, in a place where there is no night to sleep through and no morning to hope for. The man who once stole the food of the gods and handed it out like party favors now stands eternally hungry beneath food he can never touch. The man who served a false feast can never attend a true one again. If you are still with me here in the dark, and I hope you are, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists for. It is called Sleepable Mythology, and following along just means the next one finds its own way to you, instead of you having to go looking for it. Now, back to the man in the water, because the sources were not finished with him. Some versions add a third torment, and it is the one I find genuinely the worst. In the telling that comes down through Pindar and later through writers like Hyginus and Pausanias, there is also a great rock, a boulder, suspended in the air directly over his head, balanced and trembling, eternally about to fall and crush him. It never falls. That is the point. He can never relax for a single instant, never look down to chase the water without the certainty that the stone is up there, waiting. Hunger, thirst, and dread, braided together into one sentence with no end. You can see this version on a red figure vase from southern Italy, made in the 4th century before the Common Era, where Tantalus stands pointing up at the cliff that hangs above him, frozen forever in the gesture of a man who has just understood what is going to happen to him for the rest of time. And here is where the language comes in, the thing I promised you at the start. The Greeks looked at this image, a man tormented by something desirable held perpetually, deliberately just out of his reach, and they gave his name to that sensation so completely that when English-speaking writers needed a word for it 2,000 years later, they reached straight back to him. To tantalize, the word entered English late, around the end of the 16th century. One of its earliest appearances is in a poem by an Elizabethan writer named Robert Toft, pleading with his own soul not to torment him. From that little verse it spread, and now it is everywhere, worn so smooth by use that nobody remembers there is a screaming man inside it. The philosopher Plato, by the way, had his own theory about the name. He thought it came from a phrase meaning, "he who has much to bear." And modern scholars admit, a little reluctantly, that Plato might actually have been right for once. So that is the man, and that is his eternity. Case closed. The cruel king got the cruel ending he earned, and the lesson is tidy. Do not test the gods. Do not break the sacred meal. Hubris is punished. Except that one of the greatest poets in the history of the Greek language read this story and decided it was a lie. In the year 476 before the Common Era, a poet named Pindar, the most prestigious composer of victory songs in the Greek world, the man cities and tyrants paid enormous sums to immortalize their triumphs, sat down to write an ode for a Sicilian ruler named Hieron, who had won a horse race at the Olympic Games. This poem is known as the first Olympian ode, and it became the most quoted poem of its kind in all of antiquity. The ancient critic Lucian called it simply the best of them all. And right in the middle of this glittering commissioned celebration, Pindar does something astonishing. He reaches for the old story of Tantalus and Pelops, because Pelops was the legendary founder of the very games being celebrated. He starts to tell it. and then he stops and refuses. He will not say that the gods ate a child. He recoils from it on the page. The story that they were served human flesh and that one of them swallowed it. Pindar declares this to be slander, a piece of ugly gossip invented, he suggests, by some envious neighbor who wanted to drag a great family's name through the mud. Profit is rarely the slanderer's lot, he says, distancing himself from the tale, even as he repeats just enough of it to make sure you know which tale he means. The gods, in Pindar's telling, simply could not have done this, because the gods are not gluttons and they are not cannibals, and any story that says otherwise is a story about the storyteller's own corruption, not about the gods. So what does Pindar put in its place? Something tender, almost. In his corrected version, there was no murder. The truth, he says, is that Poseidon, god of the sea and of horses, fell in love with the beautiful young Pelops and carried him up to Olympus to live among the immortals, exactly as Zeus would later carry up the boy Ganymede. Pelops did not vanish into a cooking pot. He vanished into a god's affection. And the gossip about the feast only started, Pindar suggests, because a boy disappeared and the neighbors' imaginations did the rest. As for Tantalus, his crime in this version shrinks back down to the theft. He stole the nectar and ambrosia and shared the secret of immortality with his friends. And that was enough to damn him. Now, you can read this cynically. Pindar was being paid by a powerful man who claimed descent from this very family, and "your ancestor was loved by a god" is a far better line for a paying client than "your ancestor was boiled by his father and accidentally eaten by a goddess." Of course he sanitized it. That is the worldly reading, and it is probably partly true, but there is something deeper going on, and a great modern scholar of Greek poetry, Gregory Nagy, put his finger on it. Pindar wanted to delete the cannibal feast entirely. He wanted the clean version, the loving version, the version fit for a victory hall, and he almost managed it. But there was one detail he could not get rid of: the ivory shoulder. Pindar keeps it. In his telling, Pelops is born already marked, with a shoulder gleaming like ivory, bright as polished bone. And Nagy's point is quietly devastating. That shoulder does not belong in Pindar's story. It makes no sense in a tale where the boy was simply scooped up by an amorous sea god. An ivory shoulder is only needed if something was lost and had to be replaced. The ivory shoulder is the fingerprint of the very crime Pindar is trying to erase. He scrubbed the feast off the wall, and the stain bled through anyway. The detail he could not bring himself to drop is the one that proves the older, darker story was always underneath, which raises a question Pindar never meant to raise, and which is going to take us somewhere genuinely unexpected. Why was that ivory shoulder so impossible to delete? Why did everyone, even the poet trying to forget it, have to keep it? Because, and this is the thing almost nobody who tells this story now ever mentions, the ivory shoulder was not only in the poems. It was an object, a real one, and you could go and see it. This is the part of tonight's story I most wanted to bring you, because it is where myth stops being only a story and pushes its hand up through the soil into the physical world. At Olympia, the great sanctuary where the games were held, there was a shrine to Pelops himself, the Pelopion, an enclosure of stone set apart from the temple of Zeus, holding what was said to be the hero's grave. Pelops was honored there above all other heroes. The Allians who ran the sanctuary prized him almost as highly as they prized Zeus. Each year in the dark, they sacrificed a black ram to him in a pit, pouring offerings down into the earth to the dark-faced hero below, before they turned in the morning daylight to the sky god above. It was a real cult, with real blood, conducted for centuries. And among its treasures, in the earlier days, the sanctuary displayed an actual relic, a gigantic shoulder blade, said to be the very bone of Pelops. Not a metaphor, a bone you could look at. The traveler Pausanias, writing his guidebook to Greece in the 2nd century of the Common Era, recorded the whole strange history of this bone, because by his time it had already had an adventurous afterlife. During the Trojan War, the story went, a prophet told the Greeks that they could never take Troy unless they brought the shoulder of Pelops to the battlefield. So they sent for it and carried it across the sea. On the voyage home afterward, the bone was lost in a shipwreck and sank. And then, generations later, a fisherman hauled up his net off the coast and found, tangled in it, an enormous bone, so huge he had no idea what it was. An oracle eventually identified it. The lost shoulder of Pelops, returned by the sea. It was given back to Olympia and guarded as a sacred object. Sit with the size of it for a moment. A bone so large that a fisherman could not recognize it as belonging to anything he had ever seen. A shoulder blade bigger than any human shoulder blade could possibly be. Here is what was almost certainly happening, and it comes from the work of the historian Adrian Mayer, whose book The First Fossil Hunters changed how we read these stories. The land around the Aegean is full of fossils. The most common large fossils in Greece are the bones of extinct mammoths and mastodons, and the limb and shoulder bones of those animals are roughly 3 times the size of human bones, with broadly the same shape. The ancient Greeks were farmers and travelers. They turned these enormous bones up out of hillsides and riverbanks constantly, and they did exactly what we would do with no biology to guide them. They reasoned that the world had once been full of beings far larger than us. Heroes, giants, people 3 times the size of ordinary men, which is, not coincidentally, exactly how heroes appear beside ordinary mortals on Greek vases. So the giant shoulder of Pelops at Olympia was, in all probability, a fossilized bone of an Ice Age animal pulled from the earth, recognized as something impossibly large and old and powerful, and woven into the story of the hero whose shoulder had famously been remade. The myth and the object held each other up. The bone proved the story. The story explained the bone. And the ivory shoulder that Pindar could not delete from his poem, the detail that made no sense in his clean version, was anchored all along to a real thing that people had actually held in their hands and laid before their god. That is the moment I find genuinely hard to get over. This is what I asked you to hold the ivory shoulder for. The same detail Pindar could not delete. The same detail that has no place in a clean story about a god's affection. It was always pointing here, to a bone in the earth and a cult that bled black rams over it, and a civilization trying to make sense of what kept surfacing out of its own soil. We tend to imagine myth and reality as separate countries. But here they are the same country. A real fossil, a real shrine, a real annual sacrifice in the dark, all braided around a story about a boy reassembled from a cooking pot with a piece of ivory where his shoulder should be. The Greeks were not being childish. They were doing their best, with the evidence in front of them, to explain a genuinely puzzling object that the ground kept handing them. And the boy at the center of it, Pelops, the survivor, the one with the famous shoulder, grew up. I told you we would come back to him. Because the most uncomfortable thing about Pelops is not that his father tried to kill him. It is what he became after he lived. Pelops grew into a young man, and according to the gentler strand of the tradition, he was beloved of Poseidon, who taught him to handle a chariot and the divine horses of Olympus. He left the gold-veined hills of his ruined homeland and crossed into Greece, to a region in the south, where he set his heart on marrying a princess named Hippodamia. There was an obstacle. Hippodamia's father, King Oenomaus, did not want her married at all. Some say because he loved her himself, others because a prophecy had warned him that his son-in-law would be the death of him. So he had devised a test that was really an execution. Any man who wished to marry his daughter had to race him in a chariot. If the suitor lost, he died. And Oenomaus, who possessed horses of supernatural speed, never lost. By the time Pelops arrived, the king had already killed somewhere between 12 and 18 young men this way. The sources disagree on the count, and had nailed their heads to the columns of his palace as a warning to the next hopeful fool. Pelops, the story says, saw those heads above the door and very nearly turned around and went home. He did not go home. Instead, he made a plan, and the plan is where the survivor of the cooking pot becomes something darker than a victim. Pelops went secretly to Myrtilus, the king's own charioteer, and bribed him to sabotage his master's chariot. The price, depending on the version, was half the kingdom and the right to the first night with Hippodamia. Myrtilus agreed. The night before the race, he pulled the bronze linchpins that held the wheels onto the axle of Oenomaus's chariot and replaced them with pins he had made out of beeswax. The race began. It was close and long, and the king was gaining, his spear already lowered toward Pelops's back. And then the wax pins gave way, the wheels flew off, the chariot shattered, and Oenomaus was thrown and dragged to his death in the wreckage and the rains. Pelops won. He had his bride, his kingdom, his life. And then he did the thing that sealed everything. Riding home in triumph with Hippodamia beside him and Myrtilus, the man who had handed him the victory, in the chariot, Pelops decided not to pay. He threw Myrtilus into the sea. Some say he did it to be rid of a witness, others that Myrtilus had insulted Hippodamia, and Pelops killed him in fury. Either way, as Myrtilus fell towards the water, he did what dying men in these stories always do. He cursed Pelops. He called down ruin not only on Pelops, but on every child and grandchild and great-grandchild that would ever come from him. And here is the weight of it. That curse did not stay theoretical. Pelops and Hippodamia had sons, and two of those sons, Atreus and Thyestes, murdered a third, their own half-brother. And from Atreus came Agamemnon and Menelaus, the kings who would launch 1,000 ships against Troy, the king who would sacrifice his own daughter for a favorable wind, the king who would come home from the greatest war in legend only to be murdered in his bath by his own wife. The entire blood-soaked saga of the House of Atreus, the family at the center of Greek tragedy, the curse that the playwrights returned to again and again, all of it traces back, generation by generation, to a rigged chariot race and a broken promise, run by a boy who had himself been pulled out of a pot. Notice what kind of crime keeps happening in this family. It is not random violence. Watch the pattern. The grandfather served a guest a poisoned meal. 2 generations later, Atreus would murder his brother Thyestes' children, cook them, and serve them to their own father at a banquet of supposed reconciliation, letting Thyestes finish the meal before showing him the heads. The same crime. The exact same crime. The sacred table, turned into a weapon, by the same bloodline, across the generations. It is as if the family inherited not just a curse, but a method. So step back with me now, here in the quiet, and let us ask what all of this was for. Why did the Greeks tell and retell this story for 1,000 years? Why does it still have its hooks in us? I think it is about the table, about the meal, about the most basic, fragile agreement that human beings make with one another, which is, I will not poison the food I give you. When you accept a cup from a stranger, when you sit down at someone else's hearth, when you let your guard down enough to eat, you are extending a trust so total and so quiet that we rarely even notice we are extending it. Civilization is, in a sense, just a very long agreement not to break that trust. The Greeks personified the agreement as a god, and they imagined what it would look like for a man to break it as completely as it could possibly be broken, and then to keep breaking it down through his descendants until a war and a dynasty had burned. And the punishment they gave that man is the perfect mirror of the crime. He poisoned the shared meal, so he is condemned to a meal he can never share, food and water held forever at the exact distance of almost. He turned abundance into horror, so he stands in eternal abundance, dying. The Greeks understood that the cruelest thing is not to be denied. It is to be shown. There is one last image I want to leave with you, because it ties the whole bloodline into a single, almost unbearably gentle picture. Tantalus had other children besides Pelops. One of them was a daughter named Niobe, and Niobe's life ended in its own catastrophe. She boasted that she had more children than the goddess Leto, and in punishment Apollo and Artemis killed every one of her sons and daughters, and Niobe, undone by grief, fled back to Mount Sipylus, the family's homeland, and was turned to stone. A weeping stone, a rock on the mountainside, formed into the shape of a grieving woman that seems to cry. And that rock is still there. On Mount Sipylus, above the Turkish plain, there is a limestone formation that has been identified with Niobe since antiquity. Pausanias himself went and looked at it. The stone is porous, and when the snow melts and the rainwater seeps through it, water runs down the rock face like tears, exactly as it has for thousands of years. The poet Ovid gives us the most haunting moment of the whole family. In his telling, when Niobe's children are dead and the whole world has turned against her, only one person weeps for her, her brother Pelops, and as he mourns, he tears his garment from his shoulder, and there, in the firelight, you can see it. The ivory, pale and smooth and permanent, the mark his father's knife left in him, bared at the exact moment he grieves for his sister, the two cursed children of Tantalus joined in a single image, one made of weeping stone, one with a shoulder of carved bone, both of them paying forever for a meal they did not cook. So let the fire burn down now. You are warm and you are safe, and the table where you sit is an honest one. Somewhere in western Turkey, a rock is weeping snowmelt down a mountainside and has been for 3,000 years. Somewhere in an old poem, a king stands chin deep in water he will never drink, beneath fruit he will never taste, with a stone hanging over his head that will never quite fall. He reaches up. The branch lifts away. He bends down. The water sinks. He straightens. It rises again to his chin. He has all the time there is. You do not. You have this quiet and the slow weight of your own breathing and the warmth of a room with no gods at the table. That is enough. That is more than Tantalus ever had again. Rest now. The mountain is dark, and the gold sleeps in its veins, and the dish is covered, and you do not have to lift the lid. And when you are ready for the next one, there is a second feast in this family. 2 generations on, another father, another table, another covered dish, and a brother who does not know what he is eating. The story of Atreus and Thyestes, and how the curse of Tantalus finally came due. Follow along, and it will be waiting for you here, in the quiet, the next time the dark runs long. But that is for another night. Sleep well.